all depending on the time zone from which you are joining us. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Lieke van Maastricht, as well as all our presenters and attendees to the International Conference on Language Education and Learning by the International Linguistic Society. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us, and we wish you an engaging and insightful and a successful conference. And we will start off with our keynote speaker that will be presenting her paper on L2 prosody learning and teaching, the bridging the gap between research and practice. Thank you. You may.
Thank you very much for having me. I am happy to be here. Can everyone hear me and see the screen that I'm sharing? It's all going well? Okay.
Yes,
Let
we
me
can
know
see.
if you have any trouble. Good. Okay, so I'm happy to talk to you a little bit about my research so far, which has been about the learning of the prosody of a foreign language, as well as teaching it. So we see that very often in classroom settings, prosody is not something that's included yet. So I'll explain a little bit what prosody is and how you can learn it, why you should want to. We'll go over the whole thing. And I wasn't exactly sure how much time I would have, so I'm going to go over a few studies relatively quickly. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask for more details at the end. I'd be happy to explain a little bit more. Before we dive into the studies themselves, I would really like to highlight that all of the research that I do is a team effort. I very rarely work on things by myself. And so all of the studies that I'm presenting to you today wouldn't have been possible without these excellent colleagues that I was very fortunate to work with over the last, I guess, more than a decade by now at different institutes and on different topics. So here's to Team Science. So what would I like to talk to you about today? Well, I will explain a little bit, like I said, what prosody is and why it should play a very important role in our foreign language acquisition classrooms, why it often doesn't, and if you do want to teach it, which factors influence L2 prosody acquisition? What happens when we get it wrong? How does that affect communication? And are there things that we can do to help ourselves learn the prosody of a foreign language or even teach it in a classroom setting? So here we go. First for the what and the why, because maybe up until this point, you've been thinking, what is prosody? So this is, of course, a conference on language education and learning. So I'm hoping that once you get past the term prosody, if you don't know what it means, you will still intuitively think, oh, yes, I know what this is. Because it's something that all languages have. It's something that we are confronted with every day, that we use every day. But very rarely are we aware of it. So prosody refers to the sounds of speech that are larger than the segmental level. And what do I mean by the segmental level? So the vowels and the consonants of a language. The vowels and the consonant sounds of a language often receive quite a bit of attention in foreign language classrooms. You learn how to roll your R's like they do in Spain, or you learn the sound that's very typical of English. But suprasegmentals, as prosody is often called also, these sounds of a language that are bigger than just vowels and consonant sounds, they receive relatively little attention in foreign language classrooms. And I'm then talking about things like the rhythm of a language or its intonation pattern, its word stress patterns. And as researchers, when you investigate prosody of language, you can look at things like the intensity, so the volume of speech. We look at the duration of certain elements of speech, for instance, syllables or words or even whole phrases. And one of the very important aspects that we look at, the phonetic realization of intonation, which is the fundamental frequency of a speaker's voice, so their pitch. These are some of the things that you can measure about prosody. But when people think about prosody, and when for a long time, when people spoke about prosody, They refer to it, for instance, like the music of speech, because we are talking about intonation, we're talking about rhythm. It's sort of like the melody and the rhythm of speech. And by presenting it that way, it sounds nice, but it's also often considered just something that's nice to have, the cherry on the cake, so to speak. A nice layer that's sort of draped on over language that makes it sound nice. However, if you look at what prosody really does for language, for communication, it really isn't just nice to have. And Hidalgo Navarro and Cabedo Nebot in 2012, they wrote a book about how to introduce prosody in the foreign language classroom, specifically about Spanish. And they said something that I think is a really nice metaphor. Prosody constitutes the scaffolding of the building of language. So, what does that mean? It means that if you consider language to be a building, a construction, then prosody is not actually, the color that you decide to paint your building after you've built it, which could be red or it could be blue, and it doesn't really matter much. It is actually something that holds up the entire building all throughout the structure. And that is exactly what prosody does, because as you will see later, prosody influences and interacts with the morphology of language, the syntax of language, the semantics, the pragmatics of language. It influences how fluent we are perceived to be. So, really, prosody is ingrained in all of the levels of language as we know it. But when we learn a foreign language, we don't talk about it much, which seems strange to me. So, if I give you a little bit of a list, what do we use prosody for actually? And this is by no means the complete list, there is more. But this is just to give you an overview. And you can see in this overview that some of the things that we use prosody for are linguistic in nature, and other things are not necessarily tied to language, but more to communication in general. So we use prosody to identify the language that we are listening to, for instance. If you hear your neighbors having an argument and you put a glass to the wall to hear if you can pick up something, then maybe you still can't hear individual words, but you often hear the rhythmic aspects of the language that they're speaking, the melodic aspects, their intonation. So you might at least be able to say, based on their prosody, are they arguing in English or are they arguing in French? You use prosody when you're trying to disambiguate syntactically ambiguous sentences, when you are trying to figure out whether it will soon be your turn to speak in a conversation, or when you're actually trying to hold the floor for a little bit longer, making sure that no one else interrupts you. You use it to recognize what a word is going to mean, to predict its lexical meaning. You use it to communicate whether you're asking a question or making a statement. You are using it again to highlight which elements in your sentence are more important or more informative than others. And outside of the linguistic realm, you use it to say a little bit about who you are. So if you hadn't seen my face yet in this Zoom meeting and you were just listening to my voice, then my prosody would have told you something about the social group that I'm a part of, whether I'm a woman or a man, whether I'm young or older. You might be able to hear something about my voice that communicates that I'm happy, sad, nervous. And if you know me a little bit better, then you are also going to realize that I use prosody quite a bit to express irony and sarcasm. So prosody is everywhere in our communication, and we use it all the time, not only to communicate meaning ourselves, but also to interpret the communicative messages of others. So it should really be everywhere in our foreign language classrooms. And the question is, why isn't it? Well, there are a few reasons that we can think of. And there are a few more that we still need to investigate. So, one of the things that we already know quite a bit about is that when we learn a foreign language, we often take aspects of our native language and we copy them onto our foreign language, L1 to L2 transfer. And when I started my PhD, which is when I started looking into prosody, some studies had already started to show that this might be going on for prosody as well. And during my PhD, I did a bunch of studies that confirmed this. If you look at the list that I just showed you, you might also realize that there is this many-to-many form-function mapping when it comes to prosody that makes it a daunting task for foreign language learners to do consciously. Because if I use prosody for so many different things, and there are only so many prosodic cues that I can manipulate to convey those meanings, then that means that I have to use the same prosodic cues for different meanings. And in one sentence, for instance, I could use my intonation pattern to tell you that I want to keep the floor, so don't start talking yet. I could also express that what I'm saying is a declarative sentence and not a question. I might use intonation in the exact same sentence to say which part of my statement is the one that I want you to pay attention to, what is the core part of my message. And maybe at the same time, my voice lets you know that I'm excited to be talking to you. So I'm using intonation, or at least the pitch of my voice, for these four different things at exactly the same time. And that's what I mean with a many-to-many form-function mapping. And then some of the more formal things that have held us back in teaching prosody explicitly in a foreign language classroom. At the moment, teachers don't really receive a lot of instruction on how to teach prosody in a foreign language classroom yet. They also don't have a lot of educational materials at their disposal yet that they can use that are ready-made. They often have to make their own materials. And taken together, this in students causes a lack of practice at nice prosody in a foreign language, and a lack of input that they receive that they can base their practice on. So these are some of the things that in my own research and work at the moment as a linguist, but also a teacher of a foreign language, in my case Spanish, I'm trying to bring together. So it's really exciting for me to be able to talk to you about this today. So what do we know about how the learning of the prosody of a foreign language works? I did a bunch of studies looking at the different factors that influence the learning of the prosody in a foreign language. One of them was about the intonation of a foreign language. And these are all studies that I did during my PhD, and they all focused on Dutch people trying to learn Spanish and another group of people who were Spanish trying to learn Dutch. And I had native speaker groups of those two languages as well. And we looked at the whole proficiency range. So people just starting out at A1 level all the way up until C2 level speakers of a foreign language. And one of the things that we expected them to show transfer on is the use of intonation to mark new or contrastive information in a foreign language, because we know that Dutch and Spanish differ in this respect. So for instance, you see a bunch of pictures here. We used them in a game to make people describe what they saw on these images. And in Dutch, your prominence in your voice and your intonation sort of moves wherever the new element in the noun phrase in this case is. So if I have a red donkey and a blue donkey, then I would, in Dutch, I would have to say rode ezel, blauwe ezel. Now the blauwe is receiving more emphasis through my intonation because it is the new word, because ezel is actually being repeated. So it's not that important anymore. You've already heard it. And when the new word is not the adjective, but the noun, then that's where the prominence in the form of a pitch accent goes. Blauwe bezem, blauwe ezel. But this is not the way that it works in Spanish, because in Spanish, when you tell people you can only use this word order, which is what we did here in this game, then they will tend to produce the same prosodic pattern, irrespective of which word is the new or important one. So a Spanish person would say burro rojo, burro azul, but also escoba azul, burro azul. And indeed, what we found is that when you have non-native speakers do this game and produce these sentences, then they will transfer their native language characteristics to the foreign language that they are trying to learn, both in Spanish and in Dutch. So Spanish people learning Dutch would say something like rode ezel, blauwe ezel. I have to force myself to say that right. And the Dutch people learning Spanish would say something like escoba azul, burro azul, which is also not typical of Spanish. So what we found in that first study is that transfer happened, prosodic transfer from the L1 to the L2 at every proficiency level. So the general proficiency level of a speaker in the foreign language is a predictor. It affects prosody acquisition, but even at a high proficiency level, we still saw that speakers transferred the patterns of their mother language to the foreign language. We also found some evidence of bidirectional transfer. So the really good foreign language speakers actually took some of the things that they did right in their foreign language and transferred them to the prosody of their mother language, which was an interesting finding as well. I also looked at rhythm, another important aspect of prosody, because I also wanted to know whether the learning direction in and of itself contributed to the acquisition, in this case, of speech rhythm. So I wanted to know if you are learning Spanish as a native speaker of Dutch, would it be easier or more difficult to acquire the right rhythm than the other way around? So being a Spanish person, a Dutch person learning Spanish, or a Spanish learner of Dutch. It's basically what I'm saying here. And I spent a summer holiday looking at all of these different sentences that we collected and comparing and scoring for different rhythmic aspects. Now, I'm not sure whether you're going to be able to hear this because I couldn't really check whether you are also able to hear my sound. So we're gonna have an experiment here, see if it works. I'm gonna let you listen to the first speaker and you'll tell me if you hear them or not. Maybe by means of a thumbs up or a thumbs down, you can let me know whether you heard something.
We didn't hear anything, sorry.
Okay, that's all right. No worries about it. So I can, anyone who's interested, come back to me later and I can let you listen to some of this. But the findings of this study is that Dutch learners of Spanish and Spanish learners of Dutch actually don't learn the rhythm of their foreign language in the same way. So we found differences in their trajectory. So the Spanish learners of Dutch, they went really fast at the beginning, but then they plateaued and they didn't really advance any further. Whereas the Dutch learners of Spanish sort of more linearly kept developing their rhythm until they attained a rhythm that was close enough to a native rhythm in Spanish. So these different trajectories, we were thinking about where do they come from? And we proposed that at least some part of that is due to consonant clusters. So in Dutch, we can have pretty complex consonant clusters where a lot of consonant sounds follow each other, like rfst can be one syllable in Dutch. That's a pretty complex syllable structure that is impossible in Spanish. However, if you look at it the other way around, the Dutch people would know the complex consonant clusters, but also the more simple ones like consonant vowel that are very frequent in Spanish. So going from one system where you know more than you need to for your foreign language, but only activating a part of that for your foreign language, appeared to be easier than having a certain system for your native language and then having to learn a new component for a foreign language like consonant clusters. So in short, we found that proficiency level, the direction of learning the phonemic structure and bidirectionality all affected the success with which people attained the prosody of a foreign language. And if we look at what that means for communication, and I'll go through this a little bit faster so that we have enough time for questions at the end, what it means is that when you investigate the effects of prosodic errors on perceptions by native listeners, then we find that native listeners find speech that has prosodic errors, find that it sounds more foreign accented, less like a native speaker, and they rate it as more difficult to understand. However, that last measure is not the same as actually more difficult to understand. So we also did a reaction times experiment that showed us that prosodic errors didn't actually slow down the interpretation of sentences. However, people do say that they find it more difficult to understand what is being said. We also did a study where we copied prosodic cues of a native speaker onto the consonants and vowels of a non-native speaker in different combinations to find out whether you could improve native listeners' perceptions of foreign accentedness and comprehensibility in that way. And it turns out that you can, but interestingly, different prosodic features influence perception in different ways. So you need a different combination of prosodic features to most improve people's perception of foreign accentedness, and another set of features to improve how difficult people find it is to understand a speaker. So these are interesting effects, and all taken together, what this shows is that not using the prosody of a foreign language correctly actually has important societal implications. So we've seen from these two studies that I've just shown you, but there are very many more, that prosodic errors in L2 speech contribute to native speakers' perceptions of foreign accentedness. Native speakers think you sound more foreign and less fluent when you make errors in prosody. We also know from my own research and the research of others that native listeners find speech by foreign speakers that contains prosodic errors more difficult to understand. And if those two things were not enough, related purely to communication and the communication of a message, this effect actually also carries over into the perception that people have of other aspects of that foreign language speaker. So we know that these kinds of errors actually also influence the competence that people think a speaker may have, or their intelligence and their charisma and even their credibility. So getting the prosody right is really very important. And given what I told you about how prosody also cues your own social identity and emotional state, it is really important in the formation of relationships between people. So we want to be able to get this right. And that's why in the last few years, I've also been doing research into the relationship between prosody and forms of nonverbal behavior, gesture. I do this because my research up to that date had shown me that L2 prosody is difficult for foreign language learners, but studies also showed that prominence in prosody very often aligned in time happened together with multimodal cues, so nonverbal behavior in the form of head movements or facial expressions or hand movements. And as you can see in this figure here, where you see a speech signal of a speaker, and whenever their pitch rises, so they produce emphasis in speech, very often this co-occurs with a gestural movement, the letter G in this case, produced by the hands. So very often prominence in speech and prominence in gesture happens together. And the fact that these things happen together in and of itself is interesting, but we don't really know yet how those two work together. And so in the last few years, I've been doing more research into that relationship. One of the things that really interested me is, can just the mere act of producing a gesture influence the prosody in the L1, in the L2? And to answer that question, I was in a project with a bunch of different people, one of them being Wim Pauw, who has worked a lot on the effects of motor movements in the body on the voice. So the idea behind that is that if you make hand movements like the ones that I'm making right now, then as you produce the fastest part of that movement, you actually have to use the muscles in your core to stabilize yourself, to make sure that you don't fall over. And these muscles are also the muscles that you use to breathe and to control your voice. And so the question that we asked here was, in a foreign language, does the mere act of gesturing already influence the prosodic features of your voice? And we looked at this in native speakers of Spanish as well as Dutch learners of Spanish. And we found that when they produced a gesture, that the syllable that they were supposed to stress lexically also was produced with a higher amplitude. So just moving your hands like that already made you produce a higher amplitude on a certain syllable. Now, these are what we call biomechanical constraints. So your voice is affected by the movements that you make with the rest of your body. But of course, as a non-native speaker, you also have to deal with your native system. You have to try not to have transfer effects from your native system into your foreign language system. So we've also done studies looking at different types of gestures and how they might influence whether people can learn the lexical stress of a foreign language. And in this specific study that you're looking at right now, we compared different kinds of gestures: a beat gesture, which is just a simple up and down movement, and a metaphoric gesture that told the learner something about what they were supposed to be doing, which is lengthening the syllable that you're supposed to stress in a foreign language. We used cognates, words that look very different in both languages, in this case, Dutch and Spanish, but crucially that differ in the position of the lexical stress, which makes it extra difficult for foreign language learners to get them right. And so learners would see something like a video like this. There is audio, but you won't be able to hear it, but you will be able to see the beat gesture first, as well as the metaphorical gesture that tells them lengthen your syllables. There you go. And even though we didn't find an interaction between gesture condition and testing moment in this specific study, showing us really that with training, everyone improved a little bit, irrespective of which gestures they saw, we did see a lot of interactions between some individual measures that we also took into account and their performance in the lexical stress training. So people, we took a bunch of different scores of how well they do in musical perception. So how well are people able to distinguish between different melodies, different accent patterns, different rhythm patterns. And we found that a lot of those individual measures actually did interact with gesture and testing moment. So we concluded from this that individual differences are an interesting avenue that we should take into account. Okay, so taken together, I hope that I've convinced you that, one, prosody is not just the cherry on top. It is actually the scaffolding that's holding up our whole building of language. Non-native or nonverbal behavior like facial expressions, hand movements, body postures might help us when it comes to producing the prosody in a foreign language. And this is important because if we get it wrong, it affects the communication between speakers. Now, what would I like to see moving forward, and what am I working on currently that's not finished yet? So one of the things that I would really like is a way to automatically assess L2 prosody. Because if we can give teachers and students a tool that they can use to evaluate their own prosody or the prosody of their students in the case of a teacher, then this would be a valuable tool to introduce prosody in the language classroom. You can look at how well am I doing, but also where are areas of improvement for me, because we saw that prosody has such a wide range of functions. So you want to know where you're already doing well and where you would like to improve. And that's what my NWO project, It's Not What You Say, It's How You Say It, is about. I would also love to see more studies that look at these individual differences, like the ones that I mentioned in musicality, and tie them into prosody acquisition research. So maybe working memory, language aptitude, attitude. There are all kinds of individual measures that we're not necessarily taking along in our research to date. We also are seeing that the first models of L2 acquisition are being produced that take prosody and even multimodality into account, which would be a real step forward in my opinion. And I'm really hoping that some of this will lead to more didactic tools and teacher training, so that actually incorporating L2 prosody in the classroom becomes easier. I've been working on an article describing some different practical tools that teachers can use. Some of the developments, recent developments in AI will help us to create materials faster, but we still need teachers to be able to understand what prosody is, what it does, and why you should be willing to learn it to check whether the things that we are making make sense. And I'm hoping that my presentation of today has contributed some of that to you. So thank you very much for listening. And any questions that you may have, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you, Lieke, for your presentation. A very well thought presentation with all your graphics. I can see you've put in a lot of time and effort in it too. You presented it very well. I would just like to ask, do we have any questions? We have Antonis there.
Oh, thank you, Lieke, for your excellent presentation indeed. I must
Thank
say
you.
that a lot of memories have come back during the decades, what we were studying through the times, and one particular prosody and gesture. This I remember. I mean, in the 90s mostly, they started parallel at the same time about Stockholm and Grenoble, those two groups. And my question automatic would be, yes, usually we have a correlation between focus and gesture, but what about if we have parenthetic information or the focus? Do we have different levels of gesture associations, or we have some small variability for the focus constituents?
Yeah, so if I understand your question correctly, you're wondering about, should gesture and emphasis in speech and prosody, should they always be happening at the same time together, or can we also have situations where that relationship is maybe not so strong?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's a very valid question. And I think if we look at human spontaneous language production, then very often we see them happening together, but it doesn't have to happen that way. So if you actually force yourself, if you try to produce a sentence where you have certain parts of the sentence that you find important, there's a certain rhythm to your sentence, try and produce hand gestures or maybe eyebrow raises at a different moment in that sentence. It's actually really hard to do it. But that doesn't mean that we can't produce a sentence without using the hands. Of course we can. And we do it all the time. But what actually interests me a lot as well is that we also gesture when we don't have to. So maybe you've noticed that sometimes you're on the phone to someone, they can't see you, but you are still making your hand gestures or you're still moving your head in the rhythm of your speech, you don't have to do that. They can't see you, but you're still doing it. So there is a lot about this relationship between gesture and speech that we don't understand yet. I find it all very interesting.
Thank you. I don't know, do we have, I see we have a little time. Do we have anybody else, any other question? Because I would like to ask you a little bit more. Milana, do we have somebody else who would?
Let's quickly hear any more questions from anyone else? Going once, twice? Okay, Antinous, you can ask your next question.
I have noted a lot of interesting things you said, and which one the one interesting you mentioned, it was the bidirectionality of L transfer, and I would just confirm this, which is strange. Okay, 95% is one L1 to L2, but still Swedish, I'm well accustomed. The Greeks in Sweden, of course, in variable degrees, they speak Swedish with Greek prosody, but a lot of times they speak even Greek with Swedish prosody.
Yeah,
And
this was a very surprising finding.
And especially, if you remember, I don't know how actual it is today, Jesta Bruce's work, where the sentence accent goes after the word accent, and you have two peaks, two like bifocal, and the Greeks, when they want to emphasize, they sometimes imitate the Swedish style. And maybe
it's really interesting. So yeah, I think we saw some of this. So we saw that the people who spoke Spanish, for instance, the Dutch people who spoke Spanish at the highest level, they also started to produce pitch accent distributions in Dutch that were not typical necessarily of Dutch, and also not actually typical of Spanish. So there was something in the middle. And I remember a very nice study about bidirectional transfer by Lieke Mennen. I think it was in 2004 already. She looked at it in English and in Greek. And she also indeed found that the timing of the pitch accent, that's also something that's transferred in both directions by the speakers that she looked at, who were also all very high proficient speakers.
Thank you.
Yeah, stuff to be discovered there.
Milana, has Sarah appeared?
I have sent a message in I've sent a message. Let me just hear. Sarah, are you here? Maybe she can't see the message, but she can hear us.
Still, Lieke, I would like to ask one more thing. May I?
Yes, you may.
Of course.
Okay. Which I'm biased, but still, I mean, in my time, several decades ago, people were talking about the top-down or the bottom-up approach, which is, do we organize first the segmental and then we go to prosody, or vice versa? I mean to say, I was categorical during this time. I remember in a seminar in the United States, the speaker there, she was for the segmental to prosody. And I said, and I strongly believe, as you said, prosody is the building block. I mean to say, when we start speaking, we have to plan the prosody, meaning and prosody. Because if we don't have enough air, we restart. We have to know how much we are going to say. And I mean, segmental sequences, phonotactics, they come automatic. The brain does not have the time to think the small combinations.
Yeah.
I mean, it's obvious,
No,
but it was most of the segmentalists at my time, they were bottom-up approach. But I mean, you can't do that.
Well, I mean, it's a logical way of thinking, right? To think that we start with the smallest units and we build our way up. But indeed, actually, we now know that these processes are running at the same time, right? We must already be thinking about the prosody of the entire sentence while we start
Precisely.
speaking in the beginning, the smaller segments. And also the other way around. So we know from previous studies, for instance, by Hans Rutger Bosker and his research group, that when we hear one syllable and we can hear whether that syllable is going to be is stressed or it's not stressed, and that informs the competitors that are activated in our mental lexicon. So actually also from a perception and a lexical decision standpoint, we take prosody into account from the beginning. So if I produce a syllable like oct with stress, then my brain or the listening brain will deactivate competitors like octopus, which has stress at the end, but it will keep words like what starts with October, activated, right? So it's actually the case that we use this information actively already as we listen as well in real time. So yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Okay, thank you very much for this
Thank you.
keynote. It was not only interesting, but enjoying as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Lieke. It seems like Antonis enjoyed it very, very much.